Long ago, before this day's confusion did begin, throughout the stars did we go wandering. Distance was no barrier, and time it had no hope. Free to come and free to go. Free to come and free to go. Open up the book of stars. Open up the
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Karmic Evolution's Astrologically Speaking podcast. I'm your host, Sheri Horn Hasan of Karmic Evolution Astrology, and I'm coming to you on July 21st, 2023 from karmicevolution.com or any of your favorite major podcast stations. Just a quick reminder that this show aims to bring you the truth about astrology and your soul's karmic evolution. First, before I get to this week's astro news, you can use my usual housekeeping stuff. You can listen to this podcast anytime, as mentioned, at karmicevolution.com or your favorite favorite podcast stations. But if you go to the website page and scroll down there, you can hear not only the most recent podcast or search the archived listings for past podcasts, which you might have missed. But you can also avail yourself of a downloadable freebie labeled How to Keep Your Sun Sign Happy, which is friendly astrological advice for every sun sign from renowned evolutionary astrologer Stephen Forrest about what each of us, depending on our sun sign, needs to be happy. And just a quick reminder that the show or the podcast drops every Friday at 11 a.m. Pacific and 2 p.m. Eastern. So you can listen then, or you can listen anytime after. Now, that downloadable freebie is based on an interview I did with Stephen Forrest. It will sign you up for my Conversations About Conscious newsletter, but you can, of course, unsubscribe anytime. So be sure to grab it when you listen to this podcast, whether you do so live or after the fact, and enjoy some astrological words of wisdom. Separately, you can always follow me on my Facebook page, Karmic Evolution for Your Soul, where you can keep track of upcoming podcast content and other astro news you can use. You can check Instagram as well under karmic.evolution, so feel free to follow me there as well. Thank you. Also, I'm still offering my discounted 75-minute Karmic Evolution Natal Insight reading for only $125. That's a reduction from my normal price of $180, and the offer is for podcast listeners only. So if you're interested in astrology and want to learn more about the true meaning of your individual birth chart in order to gain greater consciousness about your soul's true mission and purpose in this lifetime, and you'd like to move from chaos to clarity about what exactly might be holding you back from achieving your most cherished desires in the areas of greatest interest to you, maybe your relationships, your career or your job, your finances or your health, then this is the reading for you. So we'll look at how the energies into which you entered this lifetime may be keeping you stuck in old habitual patterns or soul-conditioned behavior, and how such knowledge can assist you to make different, more positive choices moving forward. So if you'd like to co-create your own future happiness through astrological insight, it's easy when you take advantage of this special discounted offer at karmicevolution.com/karmic125. As I like to say, conscious awareness has never been so easy or so affordable. And finally, I'd like to add, at least one more time, that Stephen Forrest, who is one of my mentors, my astrological mentors, is offering a 5-day immersive intensive in evolutionary astrology titled Cutting Through to the Heart of the Birth Chart. And this will take place at the Omega Institute in upstate Rhinebeck, New York. So if anyone is local or from the tri-state area or from Pennsylvania or wants to come down from New Hampshire or Vermont or, to get away from the Canadian smoke maybe, astrologer and author Stephen Forrest has traveled worldwide to teach his brand of choice-centered evolutionary astrology, an integrative system which marries grounded humanistic psychology and ancient metaphysics, placing them in the context of free will and personal responsibility. Now, a lot of what Stephen does is he takes the positives from traditional astrology, but kind of blends them into the more modern concept of evolutionary astrology, which is that we are all here to evolve on our soul's true mission and path. Again, finding out what that is a lot of what he teaches. And he says anyone who has internalized the basic language of astrology will benefit from this 5-day workshop. Our aim will be to cut through the confusion that naturally arises as we contemplate the myriad of signs and planets and make a beeline for the healing words that go straight to the client's heart and ring of pure, liberating truth. Now, having been part of Stephen's apprenticeship program starting probably back in 2010 or 11 and graduating from that with a master's certification, I can tell you that astrology students, astrology enthusiasts, those who do have aims to become professional, but not necessarily even those who just want to learn more about their own charts or the charts of those they love, benefit from his teaching. So I highly recommend it, especially if you're new to evolutionary astrology or if you've dabbled a little bit but don't feel quite confident enough to actually do some chart reading. So since astrology tends to be something that develops for a lot of us into a passion, some people for the short term, but a whole lot for a lifetime, then I just want to say I highly recommend this to you. To find out more and or to register, I know that Stephen posted on Facebook about a week or two ago that he had 107 people registered to attend, which is a nice group. It's a nice location. But anyway, you can find out more or register at forrestastrology.com. And his name is Forrest. So it's forrestastrology.com. All right. I will be there, so come join us. It'll be fun. All right, so now let's get into this week's Astro News you can use. Now first, my overview. Let's remember we're in the early waxing phase of the current Cancer new moon's monthly lunar cycle, which asks us to make adjustments to the balance of power within our relationships as we move forward. As I explained last week, since May's Taurus new moon heralded a shift in who and what we value, and June's Gemini new moon, or those cycles is what I'm trying to say, saw us begin to pivot away from old partnerships that had outlived their usefulness because of the change in who and what we value. And the recent July 17th Cancer new moon brought us to an evolutionary turning point in terms of self-empowerment. And that's on both the collective and personal levels. And all of this represents, especially on the collective level, the need for some kind of evolutionary societal reforms related to the way we think about topics that, whether we currently conceive of them this way or not, affect the future not only of our planet, but of the whole human race. And I related this lunation in my last newsletter and Facebook post to the urgency behind issues such as climate change, and noted that the zodiacal moon-ruled archetype of Cancer represents the Great Mother, or the archetypal force behind the natural cycles of life, which go from birth to death. And such natural cycles have been much in the news lately. And yes, we're talking not only about climate change and the need to eliminate the use of fossil fuels over the long term, but also the right of women to bodily autonomy and their ability to choose whether or not to give birth without governmental or religious moral interference. And that includes as well not only a woman's right to abortion, but to medical assistance should she miscarry or otherwise face dangers to her health. As I wrote in my July 17th newsletter, and if you don't get my newsletter, you might want to sign up for it, especially if you go to karmicevolution.com, click on podcast on the upper right-hand banner, and download that Stephen Forrest freebie. That'll automatically sign you up for the newsletter. And as I said before, you can always unsubscribe anytime. But I wrote this in last Monday. The July 17th Cancer new moon opposing Pluto retrograde in Capricorn and squaring the newly shifted transiting karmic nodal axis in Libra and Aries finds us at an evolutionary tipping point, one that brings to the surface the struggle between the evils of corporate greed and lust for political power that have over time eroded our emotional security and need to coexist harmoniously within the natural cycles of life. So we're called now and still to plant seeds of societal reform that can help save our planet and its ability to nurture and sustain life. The currently waxing Cancer new moon monthly cycle calls for initiative action that discontinues any tendency to shy away from this fight. And that's because we're experiencing now the transiting karmic nodal shift back from the Scorpio-Taurus axis into the Libra South Node, Aries North Node energy. And this calls us all to let go of any past karmic tendencies to engage in what evolutionary astrologer Stephen Forrest calls Libran archetypal polite dishonesty in the effort to avoid confrontations. Venus-ruled Libras, a zodiacal archetype that often doesn't feel whole without a partner. So the tendency to negotiate and compromise rather than fight for our independence to be free, say, for example, of governmental or corporate control, or from old social mores about relationships in general, can become tantamount, over time, to winding up in hell via a road paved with good intentions. And that is because when we compromise too often and too frequently, the resentment generally builds. And the more we've swept our own desires and needs under the rug, the more likely that huge mound of dirt is going to trip us up, at least at some point, and we'll be forced to have that argument we've sought to avoid all along. So in short, now's the time to say, no more procrastination. The world is on fire now. Now the heat of frustration and anger continued to build this past week as Mars in Virgo exact opposed Saturn in Pisces yesterday, July 20th, and as today's Cancer Sun exact opposes Pluto retrograde in Capricorn July 21st, which will happen later this evening. We may recognize now how current power struggles represent an evolutionary turning point because as we head toward the waxing first quarter monthly lunar square on July 25th, we'll be asked then to push through our resistance to fighting for our own future survival. Now, signs of these struggles became obvious this past week as the Mars-Saturn opposition waxed in strength with the GOP-based National Defense Authorization Act, which is the annual congressional legislation that funds the United States military. And the recently passed House version, which is now under consideration in the Senate, includes a provision that limits the ability of women in the armed forces to travel for an abortion. As per NPR on July 14th, and here I quote, "A pivotal moment in the course of the debate this week came from Texas GOP Representative Ronnie Jackson, whose amendment would prohibit the Defense Department from paying or reimbursing travel expenses related to abortion care for service members, a policy implemented by the Pentagon after the Supreme Court overturned Roe versus Wade, which it did a little over a year ago on June 24th of 2022. Now, GOP House Majority Leader Kevin McCarthy, and here I again quote, agreed to demands from a group of conservatives who threatened to block a vote on the annual defense measure unless their amendments on a range of far-right policies were allowed. House Republicans were successful in pushing through amendments on various social policies, including a measure eliminating the Pentagon's offices of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and a measure denying health care coverage for transgender-related medical treatments for service members. Again, this is as per NPR's reporting. Now, what strikes me as interesting about this, particularly as the Mars-Saturn opposition was waxing into exact yesterday, is that the military, which is tasked with defending and protecting U.S. citizens from foreign invasion, defending and protecting Mars, and Mars is in the sign of service, or Virgo. And this Mars-related legislative mission has come into conflict or opposition with rigid, conservative, boundaried Saturn in Pisces, reminding us, as Pluto retrogrades currently back through Saturn-ruled Capricorn, that the U.S. government wants its military to protect its citizens, but it doesn't want to extend that protection to some of its own members. So, that's kind of I don't know, oxymoron in a way, right? Aren't our military service people our citizens? Now, we could look at that another way and say they're not protecting our citizens, but I mean this in a general way. If you're part of the armed services, this is what you do. You defend and protect. So why does the government want an armed forces to defend and protect its citizens, but it won't defend and protect its own service members? That's crazy. All right, so it seems obvious that as the Senate takes up this bill, some of these provisions may be struck. However, what's most interesting to me here is that the Virgo-Pisces axis, Mars and Virgo opposite Saturn and Pisces, which is steeped in the Christian-driven concept of guilt, and that concept considers abortion a moral and a mortal sin. And this in turn hails back to what I noted last week about Stephen Forrest's take on the current square of the transiting lunar nodal axis to Pluto retrograde in Capricorn, which is that we're tasked now with reviewing where yesterday's rigid social mores and taboos are no longer relevant to modern life. So clinging to the old way is Saturn-ruled Capricorn's MO, usually out of fear. In Pisces, Saturn has trouble maintaining his footing, so he hides behind his judgments in his efforts to ignore the unconscious portion of his psyche, which is to say the Neptunian part, which, since the ruler of Pisces represents our unconscious connection to all living beings and our ability to empathize with them because we realize, on some level at least, that we're all connected. In this case, it seems obvious that Saturn's simply hoping that the collective, which again Neptune's Pisces represents, will simply swim alongside him in agreement. But Mars says, wait a minute, guys, how does this serve the greater good? How does it defend and protect those unable to do so for themselves? And how does it defend and protect your own? Now, Saturn-ruled Capricorn's tendency is to let everyone fend for himself or herself, to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps, so to speak. However, given that we know, since the military did away with the mandatory draft back in the 1970s after the Vietnam War, it's comprised mostly of career soldiers and others who joined from the lower classes to ensure a steady paycheck, a GI Bill-funded college education, and in some cases, long-term job security. And given that we know the issues of both climate change and women's rights, in the form of pregnancy and medical care, affect the poor and people of color disproportionately for the worse, this is a battle that has greater future implications than what may initially meet the eye currently. Likewise, today's Cancer Sun Pluto Capricorn opposition heralds whether or not the world stands up to oppressive forces, and that means in our personal lives too, or whether it caves in. Together, these two energies are major signifiers, and I mean Mars opposite Saturn and the Sun opposite Pluto, of our evolutionary turning point, as I noted, both this week and last. It's interesting that as these aspects waxed this past week, we saw the visit of not only former Secretary of State and climate change activist John Kerry, but also former Secretary of State, the 100-year-old Henry Kissinger, to China. Their mission was to get China to cooperate in efforts to slow climate change. However, China's President Xi declared that his country won't be pushed in any way, shape, or form. According to the Washington Post, on July 19th, the headline read, "As the world sizzles, China says it will deal with climate in its own way." And the article quotes, "Europe, China, and North America are all struggling with heat waves, but in contrast to the consensus of the 2015 Paris Climate Accord, the world is deeply divided on how to confront climate change. As parts of the northern hemisphere reach heat close to the limits of human survival, Chinese leader Xi Jinping declared in remarks reported Wednesday that Beijing alone will decide how and how quickly it addresses climate change." End quote. This, in a nutshell, provides us a great example of a Sun-Pluto opposition's energy. As Rob Hand writes in his book, Planets in Transit, this particular aspect, and here I quote, "signifies that you may have power struggles with others, especially persons in authority, in which you will be forced to stand up for your position. Excuse me. On the other hand, you must avoid being overweening and domineering, because such an attitude will only create conflicts that you will probably lose one way or another." However, Hand continues, "You will also be able to make many sweeping and fundamental changes that you did not have the power to make before, only by thoroughly airing all grievances and making everything very clear. It will be possible." I'm sorry, let me read that again. "Only by thoroughly airing all grievances and making everything very clear will it be possible for the two of you to get past your grievances and establish a new beginning in your relationship." Now, again, this was perfectly exemplified by a headline that read, "China's Xi rebuffs Kerry's call for faster climate action." And it says, "John Kerry, President Biden's climate envoy, emerges from talks in Beijing without a new agreement. But just talking is progress," Kerry said. Chinese leaders rebuffed attempts by John Kerry, President Biden's climate envoy, to persuade them to commit to tougher climate action during 3 days of talks in Beijing, a response that suggested that tensions between the countries are making it difficult to work together on a crisis that threatens the planet. Mr. Kerry emerged late Wednesday from the lengthy negotiations in Beijing with no new agreements. In fact, the Chinese President Xi Jinping insisted in a speech that China would pursue its goals to phase out carbon dioxide pollution, as I said before, at its own pace and in its own way. Still, Mr. Kerry appeared buoyed that the world's two biggest polluters had restarted discussions which had been frozen for a year because of strained relationships over Taiwan, trade, and other issues. He insisted he was not disappointed in the outcome, noting that just talking marked progress. Quote, we had very frank conversations, but we came here to break new ground," Mr. Kerry added. Mr. Kerry said, adding, "It is clear that we are going to need a little more work." End quote. This is still from the article. "It's not hyperbole to say that the extent of global warming depends on decisions made by China and the United States. China is now responsible for almost a third of global emissions, more than all other developed nations combined. To avoid the worst consequences of a warming world, it's critical that United States, the world's largest emitter throughout history, work with China to slash carbon pollution, experts say. The talks in Beijing took place as the world measured the 2 hottest weeks on record, and Mr. Kerry urged Chinese leaders to consider the heat-scorching parts of China, Europe, and the United States as a sign of worse things to come if they fail to slash emissions of greenhouse gases. Mr. Kerry had hoped to persuade China to start reducing its carbon emissions on a faster timeline and to quickly phase out its heavy use of coal, the dirtiest fossil fuel. While the United States generates 14% of global carbon emissions, China is responsible for 31%, and its pollution is increasing every year. China has said it would hit peak emissions before 2030 and stop adding carbon to the atmosphere by 2060. But scientists say industrialized countries need to make deep and sharp cuts in carbon emissions now to stave off the most catastrophic impacts of climate change. Quote, the pathway and means for reaching this goal and the tempo and intensity should be and must be determined by ourselves and never under the sway of others, Mr. Xi said in a speech Wednesday, according to the official People's Daily. Now, it's interesting to note as an aside that where I live in the state of New Jersey, Governor Murphy has just put a cap on, I think it's 2035, that is the date by which all vehicles sold in the state of New Jersey must be electric. That's pretty interesting. So we sort of see the other side of the coin for just a second, you know. Now the Cancer New Moon's monthly theme, which started on July 17th, to continue to stand against opposition in order to empower and protect ourselves from future extinction continues as Venus stations retrograde at 28 degrees and 36 minutes of Leo, and the Sun enters Leo on July 22nd. And just after that, wounded healer Chiron stations retrograde at 19 degrees and 58 minutes of Aries on July 23rd. Now, as a quick aside, that degree that Chiron stations retrograde at is just short of the U.S. Sibley chart's natal Chiron at 20 degrees and 8 minutes Aries, which will retrograde back to 15 degrees 27 minutes of Aries by the time it stations direct again on December 26th, which will just happen to be at the Cancer full moon. So this in turn will be a period when some of the U.S. Chiron configuration will be triggered or re-triggered, and that's something that I plan on discussing in greater detail in a future podcast, but I just want to make note of it. We're talking about the wounds, the natal wounds to America, and I have a lot to say on that score, so keep that in the back of your mind. Meanwhile, however, these two astrological events, the Sun and Venus in Leo, Venus retrogrades, while the Sun enters, and, three events actually, and Chiron's retrograde, station retrograde, call us to have the courage to review our old, outdated values and how these may have wounded us in previous or current partnerships. Now, a good example of this, just in general, might be the couple who's miserable but stays together based on the belief that doing so is, for the good of the children. Or perhaps, it's a time when we might be able to rethink how some of us feel about same-sex marriage or the equality of the LGBTQ population, and stuff like that. I mean, it can work either way. It's true also that old flames may reappear between now and Venus's station direct on September 4th at 12 degrees 14 minutes of Leo to test whether short-term pleasure supersedes long-term value and whether we should recommit anew or move on. Just like Mercury retrograde, it's a time when people may come out of the woodwork from the past. Oh my God, I'm so sorry I broke up with you. I really realized how much I love you, blah, blah, blah. And, the question is, did the relationship have value and merit then? What was the cause of the breakup? And should you trust again, really? In some cases, the answer might be yes, and in a whole lot of them, it probably is no. But, these are the things that happen during retrograde periods, particularly of Venus and sometimes of Mercury. But here are some valuable basics given to us by Jungian astrologer Erin Sullivan in her Retrograde Planets book, which a lot of you guys who are regular listeners will have heard me quote from before. I really do think she's quite brilliant, obviously. And Sullivan writes, quote, "The lessons learned during the course of the 40-day retrograde period of Venus are relative only to the individual experiencing them. The transit of Venus retrograde exposes the need to see aspects of the self which are normally hidden from view. The degree of discord within one's personal life that arises during the retrogression signals the distance that one is from one's core values and higher creative inspirations." Remember, Venus deals with creativity. It's also, a signature of the things that we find pleasing, both pleasing to the senses and aesthetically pleasing. I mentioned last week that the actors from SAG-AFTRA have joined the screenplay writers and sitcom writers and Netflix and Prime Video and all of the streaming services, that they've gone on strike in solidarity together, and how that was a occurrence that happened. Well, I didn't mention this last week, but it's an occurrence that happened since Venus hit its shadow degree of 12 degrees 14 minutes Leo a while ago, and there's a lot that's been going on related to this theme, where we're looking back. We also have a new legal strategy that's being tried to actually pass the Equal Rights Amendment, which for a number of reasons got killed because not enough states ratified the amendment in time before it expired, and they're trying to find a way to circumvent that, to say they did nonetheless ratify it. So, forget about your stupid deadline. And there are other things too, which I may or may not have time to mention before I run out of time on this particular podcast. That's what happens to me. I have all this data, and then by the time I have to sit down and really put together the podcast, so much stuff is in it that I've got to eliminate some. So forgive me, I dwell on some things more than others, but they seem to be what resonate most, or what I hope resonates most with the audience. Anyway, Erin Sullivan continues in Planets in Transit about Venus retrograde. Quote, "Ideally, it's a time to contemplate what one's deepest, most personal creative needs are, and from what wellspring those needs originate. It's a time to explore one's own needs for love and nourishment, and to examine one's capacity to receive both of these life-sustaining forces. The retrograde period creates a quiet introspection which takes place on a very deep level, rather like observing one's own behavior and responses, while nevertheless participating wholly." That's being subjective and objective at the same time. Anyway, Sullivan goes on, "Of all the retrograde cycles, Venus's appears to be the most unconscious in its immediate effects, but in the long view, the most rational." End quote. Now, Sullivan, along with many other astrologers, urges us to look back 8 years for echoes of Venus retrograde's past. And here she says the inferior planets, which are the ones closest to the sun, which means the moon and Mercury, Venus, and Mars, always pick up unfinished processes where they left off in the last retrograde cycle. And Sullivan explains, Venus retrograde always transits the same natal house every 8 years, reviewing and resurrecting incomplete or dormant issues which have been quiescent since the last transit. Quote, "One gets a cold, hard look at one's relationships and at what is relevant to one's integrity at this time, she continued. On the collective level, and I find this fascinating, so buckle up, Sullivan points out that some seriously interesting stuff can go on. Quote, the station retrograde begins a time of global review, she says. The entire Earth experiences the retrograde phenomenon. We can see how it manifests in the collective by watching the news in regard to diplomatic and international relations. Maybe like the aforementioned China-U.S. Climate dispute or lack of agreement, or perhaps the situation that was recently in the news with the American soldier who apparently wandered over the demilitarized zone into North Korean territory and has essentially not been heard from since. And that's not to mention current relations between Russia and Ukraine, since Russia announced 2 days or so ago that it's withdrawing from its UN agreement not to attack Ukrainian ports, particularly in Odessa, that ship grain, etc., to the rest of the world. If I have time, I'll go back and review how much of the world's, because Ukraine is known as the world's breadbasket. We already talked about this, more than more than a year ago, because that was when Erdogan from Turkey, and he's still apparently working on it by discussing this with Russia's Vladimir Putin, to broker an agreement to allow the ships to leave from the Ukrainian ports because so much of the rest of the world depends on the grain. And in terms of Venus retrograde, a shortage in supply of grains and sunflower seeds, I guess, which made into sunflower oil and things like that are used in the mass production of foodstuffs, that we may see a rise in prices there. A shortage, B, a rise in prices. There's also some word, and this seems to relate also to the sun's opposition to Pluto right now, triggering, that Russia may attack any vessels that do come from those ports, especially those loaded with the aforementioned products. So Sullivan continues, the reconsideration of what is diplomatic and what is necessary to maintain a balanced worldview and sense of integrity is precisely what happens to the individual when Venus transits a sector of the natal horoscope. The Maya believed that the point at which Venus reaches her heliacal rising, about 6 or 7 days after the inferior conjunction, was when political situations were politically unstable and leaders insecure and fallible. Wait, what? Is Sullivan saying that after Venus stations retrograde on July 22nd and reaches its inferior function, which is when the Sun and Venus conjoin together in Leo, exact, which will be at 20 degrees 28 minutes of Leo on August 13th at 7:10 a.m. Eastern Time, that 6 to 7 days later, something major may happen on the world stage? Well, the answer is yes, indeed. That's exactly what she's saying. In fact, she notes, and here again I quote, astrologer Bruce Schofield, who's someone I know, he's part of the Astrological Society of Princeton and a great astrologer if you don't know him. He recently put out a book that I think is called What is Astrology? So you might want to check it out. But he has made a lot of predictions that have come true. Bruce Schofield says he has found the heliacal rising often corresponds to a time of failure or resignation on the part of leaders and often coincides with a major accident or storm. Now, Venus will still be retrograde at this point, but stationing and moving slowly as the sun appears to move ahead in the zodiac. Now, I just want to mention something, and I didn't actually go back to look up Venus retrograde, so maybe if I can remember, I will do that to report on next week. But I think it was yesterday or the day before that marked 50 years ago that Richard Nixon resigned from the presidency. So that's just something interesting. Anyway, in terms of what Bruce Schofield says about a major accident or storm, it's kind of a given that it's hurricane season now, especially between that period of the heliacal rising and 6 or 7 days later, which would be between August 13th and August 20th. So it would be no surprise if, some of these storms, which we know are going to happen, are hit with a potential furiousness and cause extreme damages, in large part due to climate change, and that we may see more of the same on an even more devastating level. I'm thinking of things like the hurricane that hit Puerto Rico a couple of years ago, which, they still essentially haven't recovered from. But regarding the failure of or resignation of leaders, especially leading up to the first August 23rd GOP presidential nominee debates here in the United States, it would seem that there might be some who never make it to the debate stage because they either don't meet the requirements, which means they have to have raised a certain amount of money and they have to have a certain amount of signatures on a petition. I believe there's I don't remember the exact amount. I want to say 400,000, but I don't know if that's right, from individual donors, right? They have to have, there's a minimum they have to hit of monies collected from individual donors to allow them on the debate stage. And they have to have signed petitions from a certain amount of states or a certain amount of people. Or they must drop out. So, and some may drop out for other reasons. So I don't think we have to break our brains to consider whether this might be someone like Ron DeSantis or perhaps Donald Trump, given all his legal troubles. So it's interesting to note that Trump's chart shows that Venus retrograde, or Venus will retrograde just before it exact conjoins his 29 degree 55 minute Leo ascendant, and will backtrack through his 12th house and conjoin with his 12th house 26 degree 46 minute Leo in Mars. I'd point out, too, that, his ascendant, which many other astrologers have said for years, is on the fixed star Regulus, which is the kingmaker star. You can explain why he's risen to such high heights, but Regulus historically tells us that those who reach high heights, politically or otherwise, if they're not acting in honesty and integrity, they will take a great fall from grace. And in Leo, of course, pride cometh before the fall. Now, the fact that Venus is retrograding through Trump's 12th house, and the 12th house is the house of the unconscious, because it's naturally ruled by Neptune's Pisces, it's also the house of exile and places where quote-unquote normal society does not congregate or dwell, such as hospitals, monasteries, prisons, etc. So transiting Pluto's been flirting with the cusp of Trump's 6th house of health, though it won't exact conjoin that degree at 1 degrees and 42 minutes of Aquarius until January 22nd of 2024. However, transiting Uranus will be at 23 degrees and 2 minutes of Taurus on August 20th, starting to conjoin his 24 degree 18 minute Taurus midheaven and the cusp of his house of career and wider reputation, but which will retrograde before exact conjoining there and requincunx his natal 4th house 21 degree 12 minute Sagittarius moon and his 2nd house 17 degree 27 minute Libra Jupiter. And through it all, his 2nd house progressed Libra moon will be squaring his 11th house Cancer Saturn Venus conjunction between 23 something and 25 something of Cancer, and conjoining his progressed Jupiter at 25 Libra. Now, I've spoken before about the fact that Trump has a wounded Jupiter by virtue of its conjunction natally to both Chiron and Juno and Libra in his second house. So whether this portends the beginning of the end, I am not going to predict, because that's already been done, going back as far as the 2016 presidential election, when astrologers gathered in October of that year before the November election in California for ESAR organization, and 11 of the 12 predicted he would lose. Nevertheless, this is a time period to watch. The other thing I did not do is go back 8 years in Trump's life, but anyone can do that. If you go back approximately 8 years, you're in 2000, you're in July and August of 2015. And 8 years before that, you are in, let's see, 5 plus 7 is to 2008. And before that, you're in 2000, 99 to 2000. So if you take a look at your own chart, see what house Venus is currently going to retrograde through, what it's going to aspect, and what happened during those years. If you have access to computerized software, all you have to do is run it back to see when those degrees were exact hit. I believe that Venus moves 2 degrees every 8 years from its retrograde past. So, it's going to be pretty tight, pretty close. But as I said, this is a time to watch, particularly in someone's chart like Donald Trump. Now, many astrologers also made previous predictions about his health, especially as Saturn transited his 6th house of health, but transiting Saturn's already made it safely into his 7th house of partnership by now. So this position, however, Saturn in his 7th, can spell a kind of, what have you done for me lately energy, perhaps in terms of how his partners, or former, or soon-to-be former partners, view the quid pro quos of any partnership with him now. And of course I'm speaking politically, although there is, of course, Melania. But, I'm not looking at her chart too. So they've been predicting that for years too, that she's going to leave him, but who knows. We know that Trump's family, in the form of Javanka, have moved out of his orbit, preferring not to be associated with the twice impeached, almost thrice indicted president now. So, as always, we shall see. But at least we'll have some possibility of a heads up from, between now and then. Now, Pluto, transiting Pluto, when it stations direct and re-enters Aquarius and gets to that degree I mentioned, 1 degree 42 minutes of Aquarius, will enter his house of health, and most of us would give that a degree orb, so meaning 0 42 when it hits that, which will come before January, that may be more indicative of potential health problems than transiting Saturn was when it was in his 6th house. Again, we'll see. I would mention also, I don't know if I probably said this long ago on this show, but transiting Neptune squared Trump's 21 degree, well, first it squared his 17 degree Uranus in Gemini, then his 21 degree nodal axis from Sagittarius South Node to Gemini North Node, and then his 22 Gemini Sun. And it was during this period, because Neptune recently stationed retrograde at 27, so it's already done with those degrees. It'll come back to 25 something, but it's not going to go over those degrees again. That is the beginning of Trump's dementia. That is my particular opinion. That he has dementia is not disputable in my mind. But, I think all you need to do is listen to some of his old interviews, where he displays arrogance and stuff like that, but he can string a few sentences together with his current ramblings, where he simply interrupts himself and goes off on tangents and never finishes making an actual point. And in combination also, I think this exacerbates his natal Mercury square Neptune, which, is in his case, I'm not saying this about every Mercury square Neptune, is the ability to be vague and the ability to insinuate without actually ordering people to do things, and also to just outright lie. Now, meanwhile, Ron DeSantis will see Venus retrograde opposing his natal Aquarius moon. Now, we have no actual birth time for him, but he was born, hold on a second, let me tell you. He was born on, where is he? September 14th of 1978 in Jacksonville, Florida. And the fact that his moon comes out at noon at 22, hold on, where's that chart? Give me 1 second. His moon comes out at 22 minutes and 22 degrees and 33 minutes of Aquarius. So Venus retrograde, and this is all just simple mathematics, right? If he was born at 12:01 a.m. on the day of his birth, his moon would be at 15 degrees 12 minutes of Aquarius. At noon, as mentioned, is 22:33, and at 11:59 p.m., the very end of the day, it's at 29:58. It's not going to change signs in that last minute. So it's in Aquarius. So no matter how you slice it, his natal moon will feel the effects, as it already has, of an opposition by Venus. Now let's remember too that even though this is his individual moon, which shows us that he may be very attached to family and family values and things like that, or so he thinks, and it's also an ideological moon. But I turn again to my favorite Rob Hand and his book Planets and Transits, which delineates aspects, but is also relevant to not only transits, but transiting aspects, but natal aspects. He says Venus opposite the moon is usually very pleasant, right? But remember, this is retrograding back and forth. So depending on the exact degree of his moon, it's definitely it already opposed the moon, Venus, and now it's going to re-oppose it, and then it will re-oppose again depending on what degree the moon is, right? So he says, on the negative side, this transit leads to rather indiscriminate affection because your desire to love someone overrules your normal sense of discretion. This is not especially dangerous, although Victorian astrologers believed that this transit was likely to produce scandalous relationships. We are not so easily scandalized now, but a certain amount of discretion is still desirable. It would be unwise to make a permanent commitment to a love affair that begins under this influence until you have time to think about it. But the point here that I'd like to make is that Venus is also often related to finances. And they are saying that he has spent way too much money on his ad campaigns and that he has to pivot. In addition to having put out a campaign ad recently, which is, I don't know, probably about as right-wing, fascist, authoritarian as you could possibly get. So, he's fallen from favor, which is another interesting thing to watch between now and August 20th, because it's possible that, there will be some serious loss of favor, enough to take him out of the running, or as a serious contender by or the time the GOP debates happen. Now, and the GOP debates will still be while Venus is retrograde, so the results of that may come later, and again depending on when the exact opposition from Venus hits his moon. Now, I want to finish by saying that wounded healer Chiron, station retrograde in Aries July 23rd this week, calls us also to muster the courage to speak out about old wounds in order to heal them going forward. And a Mercury-Uranus square that day, too, may disrupt our day or make us nervous or our thinking scattered, but it can also spark revelations about who or what we value most. And remember, Uranus is in Taurus, ruled by Venus. So if we take a day or two for greater clarity to arrive, we will settle in, because again, nervous and scattered thinking, unexpected disruptions to our day may throw us off our game, but if we sit for a day or two with it, we'll be able to think more clearly and better understand. The Scorpio moon squares the Leo sun July 25th. That's the first quarter lunar square, and pushes us through our monthly mission to plant seeds of evolutionary changes that empower rather than disempower us. And we may feel a little bit woo-woo or a little bit confused and need to adjust our thinking as Mercury quincunxes Neptune, and that's Mercury in Leo, quincunxing Neptune in Pisces on July 26th, late that day or early the 27th. And if we take it slow, we can use the July 27th Mercury-Venus conjunction in Leo, with Venus now retrograde, to better understand the patterns behind our perceptions of existing relationships now. So again, relationships. This whole past couple of months has been about relationships and shifts in relationships, and who do we trust, and who do we value, and should we move to someone else, or should we stick with who we've got or who we back or whatever. This is all going on right now, and I think in America at least it's pretty obvious, especially on the level of the collective. But anyway, this leads us to a Mercury-Pluto quincunx. Again, Mercury in Leo, quincunx Pluto retrograde in Capricorn, late July 27th and early the 28th, that calls again for an adjustment to the balance of power within our relationships. Mercury in Leo may want to talk about issues related to any unethical, quote-unquote, crimes committed by Pluto and Capricorn, as we review them now while Pluto is retrograde. So that is it for today. I hope this is information that you found valuable and helpful as you continue your karmic evolution in this lifetime. Please be sure to join me next week, which is July 28th, for another episode of Karmic Evolutions, Astrologically Speaking. Until then, may your journey be filled with karmic healing and the joy of greater consciousness. Namaste.
Long ago, before this day's confusion did begin, throughout the stars did we go wandering. Distance was no barrier, and time it had no hope. Free to come and free to go. Free to come and free to go. Open up the book.